What's the most shocking thing you found out about someone you know? Before we start, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. I wish you a pleasant viewing experience. Story 1. I worked with an ex-Marine for years, and closely for years. My last day I asked him to help me with something and he said, "Oh sure, ask the guy with one leg." I told him he was full of shoot, and he took a hammer and hit his shin, to which I heard metal. Thinking it was a joke, I asked him to lift his pants. Sure enough, this man had one leg, and I never knew. Answer: I worked with a guy for 4 or 5 years. He was even my boss at one point. He always carried his suit jacket draped over his right hand. I never gave it a second thought. One day I went to shake his hand, which I, for whatever reason, had never done before, and he looked at me like, "Bro, are you kidding?" He then extends his right arm, and for the first time ever, I realized he didn't have a right hand. I honestly can't remember now if he wore a prosthetic hand or simply left it as a nub, but I do remember apologizing profusely. He just laughed it off and thought I had been fudged with him. Story 2. Someone I was friends with when I was 16 ended up taking down a guy and then chopping his body up and throwing him in trash bags in the woods. Answer: a kid in the neighborhood used to be my brother's friend when they were both 9 or 10 or something. There was just something off about him, in my recollection anyway. Years later, I found out that when he was 27, he'd take down his father in a schizophrenic episode and hit him in the crawl space. He'd done time a few times out of simply being crazy and had been committed and was forced to take meds. After some time, apparently, he'd been able to convince the staff to not supervise him so closely, stop taking his meds, and proceeded to make good on his threats of eliminate his parents. Story 3. I don't know if it's the most shocking, but definitely shocking to me, and something that I still struggle with. My ex and I were together for over 20 years. I grew up really poor and in a less than ideal house. My dad died when I was young, and my mom took off with a guy she met on the internet. My ex and I started dating the first time when I was 18 or so. I chased her for years and eventually started dating, moving in together, etc. Her dad was a doctor, and they were pretty well off, and immediately took me in as one of their own. Her dad and I got along great. I looked at him like a father figure. He could be pretty demanding, but I always made myself available for anything he wanted or needed. I helped him with car projects, home remodels, trips. I took off work when they came to town, anything. You name it. My ex cheated a couple years after we moved to a new town to continue school. We split up for 2 years, and during that time, I would occasionally drive back to our old town just to see her parents, maybe grab lunch with them or something. We got back together, and a couple years later, I had my suspicions about her cheating again later on, but never proved anything. I always told her that I'd forgiven her once. If she did it again, we were done. Finally, during the summer of 2020, COVID and all of that, she basically went bonkers. Started drinking extremely heavily, partying, substances, and took off to her parents' lake house for weeks at a time. I found out that she'd been having an affair with a guy she'd met at some sketchy bar, and with that, we were done. The morning she came clean, she'd passed out the night before, and I saw all these texts come through on her phone. We had a long, very emotional talk, and I said I was leaving. Additionally, I had been paying for her phone under my plan. I told her I'd be canceling her phone, as I wasn't going to pay for her to talk to her boyfriend. She asked if she could call her parents really quick, just to explain and tell them she may be without a phone for a few hours. I was upstairs, putting some things in a bag and trying to figure out where I would go when I heard her on speaker telling her dad that we were done. She'd been seeing a guy, and I found out. I hear her dad say, and I'll remember it forever, "Good. I always told you I never liked him. I always told you you could do better." Man, that shoot hurt worse than her cheating. He was seriously like a dad to me. They were basically the only family I'd known. I loved him and thought he loved me, and to hear that he'd apparently never liked me, darn. Answer: I had one of my best friends of 5 years leave me a drunken voicemail where he explained that the reason we had been hanging out recently was because he had been spending time with better, decent friends. I had to listen to the voicemail 20 times to make sure I was hearing what I thought I was hearing. That was probably 15 years ago, and I am still haunted by it. It had been one of my closest friendships. I spent the night at his house very frequently. I knew he had other friends who had gone off to college and occasionally came around to visit, but I hadn't realized that he thought so little of me. Still hurts. Story 4. An acquaintance, really. He was a friend of a friend. Our friend had a pool and would have us over regularly for BBQ. We had a 2-year-old and I was heavily pregnant. My husband was carrying the things and our daughter ran ahead of us. She had been there many times before and was comfortable there. She did not have floaters on yet, and she ran and jumped into the deep end of the pool ahead of us. We all ran, but the acquaintance was by the pool, and he reached down and pulled her up. She stuck her hand up when she realized it was too deep. We had a great afternoon at the pool, and we visited with this man. He had grandchildren and was much older than us. We came away with positive vibes from the day. My husband saw him more frequently than I and played golf with him and his friend. We moved away about a year later and were shocked to find out that he had brutally and violently intimacy abused his young granddaughters. That's never gotten out of my head. Answer: my first supervisor in the military was a pretty odd fellow. Came in with shaved eyebrows one day because of an accident, but never seemed too sinister. He was a poor supervisor and not a great worker, but overall just another weird dude. Cut to 10, 12 years down the road, and I see an article on Facebook with his name on it and a bunch of comments from people who I worked with back then. Turns out he was in court for intimacy trafficking his own 9-year-old daughter. I may not have the age right. His wife was complicit as well, and the comments from people close to him said they would join as well. I do not know what became of her. They threw the book at him, and he will never see the outside of a prison. Passing would be too good for him. He was caught because someone tipped off his supervisor who ran it up the chain. His wife somehow found out the military FBI, were coming for him. He was in a hotel room on a work trip when he got the call and cut his own wrists. They broke his door down and stopped him from bleeding out. I think about that girl from time to time. Even though she was born after I had already moved out of state, I hope she lives the life she deserves, but it still breaks my heart to think about how difficult every day must be for her. His name was Ryan Gerhart Jones from South Dakota, and his case can be found on Google. Story 5. My best friend since elementary school wasn't really my best friend. I was friends with a couple of boys, call them Tony and Jay, who were twins. The three of us, along with a whole group of friends, were pretty inseparable for a long time. We all went to elementary school, middle school, and high school together. Well, the summer between freshman and sophomore year of high school, the twins went to Argentina to visit their ailing grandmother. Apparently, Tony decided that he wanted to make the move permanent, but Jay wanted to come home. But the thing is that while Jay was likable, Tony was always the more popular one in our group, and I guess Jay was always jealous. So he took over Tony's identity, and since they were twins, no one questioned it. It wasn't until later that things kind of stopped adding up. Like Tony's stories of things that either didn't happen or that Tony wasn't around for, but Jay was. Or things that Tony didn't remember about his relationship with one of the girls in our group. So she decided to call the family in Argentina, and they swore up and down that both boys came home. But where has the real Tony been? We don't know. We have theories that range from Tony ran away while in Argentina and Jay took over his identity, to Jay did something to Tony and took over his identity. Either way, Tony isn't Tony. Answer: so she decided to call the family in Argentina, and they swore up and down that both boys came home. What? So you're saying that one of the boys was missing? I truly don't understand. You grew up in City X with both twins. Both twins go visit their grandmother in Argentina. Only one twin comes back. This girl calls Argentina, and the grandmother says they both went back to City X. Where are the parents? Aren't the parents in City X? So the parents went along with this idea that one twin was still in Argentina? Why didn't the girl call the parents in City X? I totally don't get this. Story 6. I have a friend whom I've known for a few years. We've worked together at a couple of different places, and we get along great. He's a bit of a jackass, but generally a fun guy to talk to and hang out with. We were already in our 40s when we met, and obviously everyone has a past, but when he told me he'd spent nearly a decade in prison for attempted takedown, I was shocked. I didn't believe him. He was telling me the story of what happened, and everything seemed to make sense. He was young, just 18, and he was on substances and suffering from mental illness. When I got home that night, I did some digging and found some records that indicated he was being truthful about it. It didn't really change the way I saw him or how I felt about him at all. He's still the same person I've known all these years. Now I just know a bit more about his past than I previously did. I don't see him as more dangerous. It's just a tragic story about a kid who did something awful, paid for it, and worked his way back into society. Answer: co-worker served 18 years for takedown. Fell afoul of a law that allows someone to be charged with a crime by being with someone who committed the actual crime, even if they had no knowledge of said crime. He drove his neighbor to a shop and waited for him. The neighbor shot and eliminated the clerk while robbing him. The neighbor even testified that my coworker had no idea what was going on. Nice guy, we still talk over FB. Story 7. My daughter-in-law got with a guy and was with him for 10 years. She had a daughter before she met him, who was 4 when they started going out. They went on to have a son who is now 8. We found out a year ago that he's been intimacy abusing my granddaughter since she was 12. He got her pregnant and bought abortion tablets for her. He awaiting trial for 18 counts of intimacy assault on a child. He seemed like a nice enough guy, and we had no idea until it came out. Story 8. My dad committed tax fraud, perjury, and identity fraud against me to the Canadian government. I am a disabled university student. He is a pilot that makes $300,000 per year. Answer: been there. My mom did similar things, and I found out on my 18th birthday when I received a collections notice from a utility company. I was living at home at the time and very much not paying bills. I opened a whole can of worms that week and now understand why all her exes refuse any contact with her, my father included. She thankfully made it right for me but can't help but feel bad for all the people she's screwed over and just ghosted. Story 9. We found out at the funeral that my wife's grandpa had a second family. There was a group of people huddling around his widow, she was 90 at the time, that no one recognized. They were chatting it up with grandma for quite some time, and eventually my wife's dad and aunt asked them to leave. There was kids, adults, and seniors in this group, multiple generations of people. My mother-in-law finally fessed up and said they were his other family. Jaws hit the floor, and it was really weird for the rest of the ceremony. They also tried to claim some of his stuff afterwards. Had to watch grandma's house like a hawk, because they would snoop around and try to say, he would want us to have this. Story 10. He eliminate Jeffrey Dahmer. No shoot. I grew up in the same neighborhood as Chris Scarver. I didn't even know that was him till I attended a friend's wedding. Another guy and I were catching up, and he said, "You heard about Chris, right?" I replied, "What did that crazy MFer do this time?" He replied, "He eliminate Dahmer." Then it hit me that I saw him on TV and didn't even recognize him. Story 11. A neighborhood friend's little brother was always a little bit off, especially to his big brother, who constantly made fun of him for shoot himself when he was way past the age of it being normal. Little bro was always normal and nice enough to the friend group though, so we just assumed it was big bro making fun of him for a time in his life where he was had a medical problem and just being a jerk to little bro because he didn't want him hanging around us older kids with him. When we'd call out big bro for being mean to little bro, he'd assure us that he's just weird, okay? Something's off with shoot stains or whatever. But we still just chalked it up to big bro being a bully and would let little bro hang out with us anyways. 20 years later, in almost the same amount of time since the neighborhood gang all hung out as kids, little bro adds me on FB. I'm happy to accept and to see that he's become an attractive, successful, happy-seeming young adult. He likes all of my recent pictures on FB, so I find it odd that he immediately starts flirting with me, having liked photos with me and my husband and kids. I tell him I'm married and he continues anyways, so I immediately block him for being a disrespectful weirdo. Not even a week later, and everyone from the neighborhood is sharing the current news that little bro just got arrested in a child prostitution sting where the FBI caught him soliciting single moms on Facebook and getting them to adult worker their preteen daughters to him for submission. One of the moms was even engaging in intimacy acts with him against their very own child. My stomach was sick for weeks knowing that the ill intent he already showed me was probably even more nefarious than I already believed. I guess big bro was right all along. Makes me absolutely sick to think about. Story 12. My cousin got serious with a guy she was dating and wanted the family to meet him. She warned us that he'd been in prison and had a past with gang substances, but had been clean for a decade and was ready to settle down. He looked the part. Gang tattoos, shaved head, silver teeth. Looked a decade older than he was. Absolutely looked like a gangbanger. At 63 and around 275, he was physically intimidating. That being said, he is absolutely the nicest guy. Very kind and respectful, and obviously in love with my cousin. Cousin had been dealt a tough hand. Absent father and a chronically ill mother, and an ex-husband that abandoned her when she was pregnant. So to see her with someone that adores her and was so wonderful with her daughter just made us all so happy. He took administrative classes while he was in prison and has used that to work his way up to a supervisor position at a local hospital. He runs outreach programs at the juvenile detention center. After he and my cousin got married, he adopted her daughter, and they have a little boy that's almost a year old. People can look a certain way and we can expect behavior that reflects that. But Joaquin taught our family that people can change if they are truly motivated to. He's such an amazing guy, and my cousin is so happy. They deserve all the good things in the world. Story 13. I was a recently graduated therapist working in a forensics heavy clinic. We were interviewing interns for their placement, part of graduate program. This was an important interview because a lot of our clinical staff myself included, were hired out of internship. A lot of the applicants were from the same graduate school that I went to, so I knew of a lot of these people personally. One of the applicants was a guy who I had a bunch of classes with. He was taking the program part-time, so he had been in the program when I started and was still there when I graduated. We had maybe 5 classes together. I knew him as a very smart, but also very sarcastic, middle-aged guy. I knew he worked as a hairdresser outside of class at his boyfriend's salon, which caused him to be very popular amongst our class for his propensity to give free haircuts. He gave a great interview, and I was pretty sure he was going to be the guy we hired. But we still had to get the basic background checks back. When we did, as it would turn out, he had committed aggravated assault and a homicide when he was 18, spent 2 decades incarcerated, and was on lifetime probation. Now he did his time, and I'm sure right now he's an excellent therapist. But because we worked in a forensics clinic, and due to state regulation, we couldn't hire anyone on probation parole on the clinical team. Story 14. My wife died 2 years ago at a young age, 49. A week later, I decided to go through her personal devices to see if there were any other friends or family that needed to be contacted. What I found instead is that my wife had always been chasing after other men during our entire 12 years together. When she met me, she had a side BF that she was crushing on, but his life was too much of a mess for her to seriously consider him as a suitor. She was a single mom with 2 kids and needed stability, but she loved the attention he showered her with, constantly begging her for intimacy. And there were other men too that she met online. In total, I was up to 6 BFs she had during the time of our relationship. I stopped digging because each new BF revelation absolutely destroyed me. It did explain, however, why our relationship stalled after we moved in together. She became disinterested in growing deeper in relationship with me and was doing the minimum to keep stringing me along because I was paying the bills for her and her kids. And because I genuinely loved her, I was always hoping things would eventually get better between us. But things were never going to get better, only worse, because she was actively sabotaging our chances. Answer: so sorry you had to go through that, mate. That's truly brutal. I found out that my very religious grandmother had an affair with an American soldier during the war, while my grandfather was off fighting the Germans. She got pregnant to him with my uncle. She told my grandfather, and he raised him as his own and never treated him any different. I know I couldn't have done that, but I think it shows the character of the man. It also goes to show that you really can't pick the types who will cheat sometimes. Story 15. My dad became a whack job born-again Shian. That's where he met his 4th wife, Donna, who fleeced him of $40,000 in the 90s. It turns out she and her daughter were on the FBI radar for working Jan circles, hooking up with loser dudes and squeezing them dry. I met her once, and surprisingly, she seemed really nice. Way above my dad's class. I guess that's what makes the scam work. Story 16. A high school friend became a multimillionaire through reposting memes on Instagram. He was a pretty ordinary guy, but had a great sense of humor and an ever-expanding meme collection. In between working at KFC, he was reposting memes on pages he made. Eventually, he sold an account for $10,000 and began managing 10 huge accounts, cross-promoting them. He began selling accounts for $50,000 every month or so. This was in the early days of when Instagram first became a chronic meme location, so like 2016 when its identity shifted. He vanished eventually, closing off most of his school connections. Nobody except his closest friends get in contact with him. I'm still connected to him, and he's just traveling the world permanently now, in his 20s. He can retire from memes. He did this before it became highly competitive and automated. Now everyone is competing for internet meme attention, and there's thousands of botted pages that automatically do this. Answer: I actually met a kid once like this. When I was traveling around Japan circa 2016, I met this 19-year-old kid who just sold his SoundCloud page for like $20,000. He used that money to travel, but also bought a really expensive camera to take pictures with on Instagram. Pretty quickly, he started getting sponsored posts, and his IG account was pretty big. 100K followers. So he basically was traveling indefinitely and getting paid for each of his posts. Dude cracked the system. Story 17. My dad taught at different local universities on the side his whole career. One of the professors, Fred, he was super friendly with, was a decade younger. My dad served as a Marine in WW2 as a teen towards the end. My dad was also German-American. He was born and raised in NYC, but spoke German with his family. Fred would always hug my dad goodbye. They mostly spoke in German. Fred was Jewish in Germany. His mother and he were hiding separate from the rest of the family. Mostly so his older brothers had a chance of surviving without needing to worry about Fred, 6, and the mom. The sister was able to flee the country, plus hiding 6 people was hard. His dad had already been taken. The Nazis were coming, and it was known that anyone hiding would be found. So Fred and his mom were buried in a box. So were other people. They were told they could last 3 days. No idea how. I wish I knew. They thought they could get to them sooner. The Nazis didn't leave as quickly as expected. They had shovels hidden and neighbors close to start digging when given the signal. My dad and other German-American Marines were in the area, all who spoke German and blending in. They showed up when digging had started. The neighbors thought they were Nazis and would be shot. Instead, they helped to dig. There is so much more that happened after this. But this is already long. My dad dug Fred and his mom out. The being buried alive part is what shocked me to the core. Fred and his mom were pretty much buried in their own grave, relying on others to not only survive, but to be able to dig them out in time. I can't even imagine Fred's mom making that decision. Fred, his mom, the sister, and only one brother survived the war. My dad and Fred had stayed in contact since then. When we would visit Germany, Fred's family would treat us like royalty. If they came to the US, they always would visit and stay with us. After I found out how they met, it all made sense. I thought my dad was just really good friends with a colleague. There are other stories I will never know. I just know as a little kid, people would come up crying and hugging my dad when we were in different parts of Germany. We would go to homes, I would play with the kids, and my dad would be with the adults. Story 18. Oh man, my childhood bestie introduced me to a guy who seemed really nice. I even thought he was kind of cute. He had a whole giant sob story about his ex being a terrible mother, and how hard it was for him to battle her in court for custody of their kid. We hung out in groups a bit over the next couple years, but never alone. One night he texts asking if I could swing by the bar they all loved to go to and drive him home, as he'd had some drinks and didn't want to risk a DUI. You know the story. Guy ended up assaulting me when I dropped him off. None of the mutuals believed me. None of my fam took it seriously. It never got reported because everyone was blaming me. Fast forward a number of years to the pandemic lockdowns. I was chilling at home with my fam, and I get a text from a random friend with a news article attached. It was about that guy. He'd apparently lost it and got stabby with his current GF, and was wanted for her eliminate. He was eventually arrested and is still on trial trying to use an insanity plea. I hope he rots. Answer: had this happened to me, except years later, the POS died by ODing. Literally the same. No one believed he could do that. People were upset. I was happy he died. 14 women showed up to his funeral, saying he had also SA'd them. The youngest was 16. He was 28 at the time. Guarantee that, unfortunately, there's so many more of us that couldn't come forward. Glad he is rotting, and hope the jerk who hurt you does too. Story 19. A guy that me and my partner knew well ended up being a convicted pedophile. He was the stepfather to a couple of kids, and his own daughter had twin girls. The worst bit, he was a policeman. There was no evidence that he interfered with his children, but his PC was full of child-adult content. Never would have thought that was his thing. Another guy that worked for me got convicted for violation. He would wait in multi-story car parks and attack women from behind. Again, you would never had guessed. Just proves that you didn't know who people really are. Story 20. I found out as an adult that my stepdad, who had been around since I was 7, did time in prison for takedown. He walked in on a man having intimacy with his wife, and it didn't end well for the other guy. Edit for clarity on some of y'all's questions. This happened like 20 years before he met my mom. He did 3 years because of the nature of the crime and laws in TX being lenient on that type of stuff. Story 21. I found out last week that someone I was in a few plays with, but never became friendly with, other than adding on my now defunct Facebook as a local theater acquaintance, is currently in jail on work release for first-degree intimacy assault of his own daughter, who is preschool-aged. Vile. And he did not come across as creepy or nasty in person. A very clean-cut, preppy, affable guy. Story 22. Someone that I went to high school with who became a family doctor got busted for being a pedophile. In the article, it said he was wanting to abuse boys and girls as young as 1 and 3. His father was a family doctor in our small town too, so it was quite the scandal. Story 23. Found out a guy I knew used to fake having a limp so he could get sympathy discounts at the movie theater. Story 24. Mid-1990s. I came home from my honeymoon to find a card at my front door from the FBI. My neighbor across the hall popped out and asked if everything was okay because there were a bunch of cops looking for me. Turns out my best friend of 5 years, who I thought had moved away to be with his girlfriend, was seducing women around the country and robbing them blind, draining their bank accounts and vanishing. He's even stolen their cars, driven to his next target city, and either sold the car to a chop shop or ditched it. He left a jacket behind at one of his victims' houses, and it had my name and phone number in his pocket. I went to the federal building in downtown Chicago answered all their questions, and convinced them I had no knowledge of any of this. And after a few hours, I agreed to let them know if I ever heard from him. About 6 months later, he calls me out of the blue. I'm like, "Hey man, how you been? Still in Minneapolis?" He said, "Nah, that didn't work out." He said he's back in Chicago, and he tried to sell me some stereo equipment. I said, "I'm good. We should hang out. I miss you, man." He was really cautious and suspicious, but eventually I convinced him to go play paintball with me as long as I paid. That was normal in our friendship. I was well off, and he usually struggled. I called the guy from the FBI, whose card I still had, said I'm playing paintball with him on Saturday in Gurnee. He just said, "Thanks, we'll keep in touch." Saturday morning comes around. I pick him up in his old neighborhood. He looks stressed and thinner, but he's happy to see me. We get to paintball about 9 a.m., and we play a few hours. Then we're all taking a lunch break and eating sandwiches when 2 black SUVs pull into the parking lot. My friend thought nothing of it, but it was definitely conspicuous. Then 2 of the guys we were playing paintball with turned to my friend and addressed him by his full name. Darn, we've been shooting paintballs back and forth with these dudes for 3 hours. They took him away in the SUVs. I acted surprised. I kind of was. I never heard from the FBI again. He spent 6 years in prison. My wife never liked him, and I despised him for what he was doing and was pissed he tried to sell me someone's shoot. Here's the kicker. One of his first victims was a girl from Joliet that he met while I was dating her. After she and I broke up, he pretended to randomly meet her at her job in the mall. They hooked up. He stole her shoot and her car and split. She was pregnant with his child. The boy's about 30 now. Many years later, she reached out to me on FB and told me all about that and asked if she should tell her son about her loser father. I didn't know how to advise her, but she did tell me later on that he died from hepatitis a few years after getting out of prison. I looked up his funeral records. He had convinced his fiancée that he was a former SEAL Team 6 member, and she insisted he be buried with honors, which I guess actually happened. That's how much of a shithead this guy was. TLDR best friend was wanted by the FBI, went to prison, died from hep after he got out, and had a baby with my ex-GF, and major stolen valor. Answer: that story was a wild ride and well worth the length. Thanks for writing it. He had convinced his fiancée that he was a former SEAL Team 6 member, was looking for this. From what I've read about these type of romance con artists, they often pretend to be in the military, sometimes even an intelligence agency, like in The Puppet Master, Hunting the Ultimate Con Man on Netflix. Something heroic, or in the medical field like a doctor. Something prestigious. That's for in-person scamming. For online scamming, they pretend to be in a job that explains why can't talk on the phone or do a video call. Blame it on bad phone reception or unstable internet connection. So they claim they're at a remote military outpost or an offshore oil rig. No one pretends to be a women's shoe salesman, LOL. No disrespect to women's shoe salesmen. Story 25. I had a friend who was deep in the rock metal scene, and we all went to this really nice New Year's party. During the night, she put her arm around me and started pressing herself into me. God, she had great boobs, and she was not being shy about it. Wow, she is really into this. But she has a boyfriend, so I can't possibly make a move. So I went to the restroom, and her boyfriend followed me in and said, "My man, when a woman puts the moves on you, you gotta take her." And then a bunch of others immediately jumped in to give girl advice. I was confused. Swingers. They were swingers. Answer: a friend of mine had friends that were swingers, but he and his girlfriend were not. He knew about it, but she didn't, and he didn't tell her as he figured it was their business. Once they were at a normal party with a bunch of those friends at one of their houses. They were getting ready to leave as the crowd seemed like it was thinning out. She went to the bathroom and opened a bedroom door to see if the host had put the coats in there, and was instead met with the sight of 8-10 people screwing each other and not matched up in the couples as she knew them. My friend had a lot of explaining to do on the ride home. Story 26. Childhood friend. I found out reading a newspaper that he was arrested with over €1 million worth of substances. He got 10 years in jail. Apparently tried to blame his then GF and mother of his child. Fast forward 10 years, I'm watching the 6 o'clock news and he's been arrested again. This time for attempted takedown. He shot his next door neighbor, leaving her paralyzed from the waist down. Ended up getting 15-20 years in jail. Story 27. I worked in an office my first job out of college, and there was a nice older man who knew the whole system we were working on and trained a few new employees. He was fired for watching adult content at work about 2 months after I started working there. I am shocked it was him, but even more shocked that a technical guy would be stupid enough to watch adult content on a work computer. Story 28. Worked for a company all through HS in college. Loved the local team, but the owner was a piece of shoot. would literally look at adult content on the work computer with others around. He would hire gorgeous women with huge boobs and just make comments about them all the time. I'm like 16 at this point. I worked for them, rarely ever saw him for years BC again. The local team was stellar. Around 10-15 years ago, my brother calls me and asks me if I remember this dude. I'm like, oh, yeah, he's a shootbag. Brother, who saw this on his local news, proceeds to tell me that he had a huge falling out with a business partner who sued him for like $1 million. Guy got so mad he hired a hitman to eliminate the guy. Turns out hitman was an FBI agent, and now dude's in prison for 25 years. Fudge dirtbag. Story 29. My aunt and grandfather fudged to show their love when she was like in her late teens, early 20s, and that my whole family knew about it. I only recently found out, so this was like 40, 50 years ago? My dad says, well, they smoked plant substance, so they wouldn't be in their right mind. Plant substance doesn't make you want to fudge your father-daughter. Answer. The more likely scenario than her consenting to it was he had been abusing her since she was little and she had no power to get out of it. A lot of people who have never worked with victims of intimacy abuse, especially by a family member, will very ignorantly say things like, she was an adult at that age, she could have just said no or never went around him for it to keep happening. It is never that simple. Story 30. The other day I found out that my uncle was a decorated war hero in Vietnam and had saved over 20 men's lives as a medic and was rewarded multiple medals by a U.S. president. He passed a few years ago. Nobody even knew he saw action in war. Story 31. My ex-sister eliminated her 6-year-old daughter in attempted tragic end. Failed. She was a child psychiatrist. Story 32. I had an old coworker who I rarely talked to. Seemed like he'd had a rough life based on what I heard about him, but overall was always nice to me. He eventually got fired for falling asleep so much and having spotty attendance over 3 years. I get a call from my boyfriend when I'm on vacation last year, and he says, you will never believe who got arrested. It was my old co-worker. He had been on the run for double homicide for 10 years. Him and his buddy eliminate 2 guys over some plant substance with the victim's kids in the house. Absolutely wild. Story 33. A distant acquaintance who seemed to always be a little mean to me turned out to be a pedophile. He drove across a few state lines to meet up with a young girl he communicated online with while being in a committed long-term relationship. Turns out the girl was an FBI guy in a sting operation. He got locked up for a few good years. Story 34. Growing up, I had a best friend that I met when we were 9, and he started as a new student at my elementary school. We did normal kid best friend stuff, and since my parents were awesome, I assumed that for everyone, him included. Years later in high school, he revealed to me that the reason he moved is because his bio dad attempted to take down him, his mom, and their siblings. The stories that followed were horrific, but the one that truly shocked me is one time he, his mom, and his sister went for a walk, and when they came back, the family dog was hanging from the ceiling, and his dad was standing beside it with a huge grin. He and I are no longer friends because he's a manipulative, narcissistic POS. But the origin story definitely checks out. Answer. This brought back a memory of mine. In 3rd grade, there was a new kid to our school. The teacher instructed me to kind of be his chaperone and show him around the school. The next day, he wasn't there. He never came back, and I never knew what became of him until our mid-20s. In a town about 10 miles away, he slaughtered his wife, their kid, and 2 people that happened to be in the house at the time before turning the gun on himself. Story 35. For years, my ex was a jolly, happy, kind, thoughtful man. I thought I had hit the jackpot. When he became abusive behind closed doors, no one believed me. He's really a monster, but he's incredible at faking it. It's uncanny. Story 36. When their kid died, him and his then-girlfriend were suspected of abusive neglect that led to the kid dying. They were cleared, but it's highly suspected it was due to a technicality, as they were both heavy substances users at the time, and the mom died of an overdose a year later. He seems to have moved on and projects a happy life on social media, but it's one of those things you'll always wonder about. Answer. I am not sure of the circumstances surrounding this story, but I'll let you know something. When I was a heavy addict of Xanax, meth, cocaine, and heroin, it was extremely common for me to just, and quite literally, forget to eat, drink, and function like a somewhat normal person. I dislike substances. I really detest their very existence. I don't even know how the fudge survived 4 straight years of that shoot. Story 37. A couple of months ago, I went to the funeral of a longtime family friend, one whose son had passed. I had no idea what happened. Another family friend, too, was going to tell me, but it was difficult to schedule time. At the funeral, everyone was talking about what an amazing chef he was, and two told me to go on his Facebook and check it out. Well, she should have told me specifically to not Google him, because here my stupid jerk was in the middle of a church, shocked ASF, to find out he not only died by tragic end, but only after walking into his work and shooting his coworkers eliminate one. I still do not know how to feel about this. Story 38. Soon, I found out my coworker who brings PBJ sandwiches to work every day and drives a 15-year-old Honda actually owns 3 rental properties and has more money in his savings account than I'll probably make in the next decade, which suddenly explained why he's the only person I know who seems genuinely unbothered by literally everything. Story 39. I was named after my father's high school ex-girlfriend that he never got over. When she dumped him, he decided to try heroin, lost his mind, and tried to jump off a water tower. His mistress was mad my mother got pregnant, so he decided to punish my mother by naming me after his high school ex. And shocking to nobody, my mother was beat down enough to just take it. I dislike my name. I dislike my father too. Story 40. My mother and 3 aunts were all molested by their grandfather. When they went to their mom, after it happened to the youngest of the 4, she scolded them, sullying his good name. Needless to say, I don't care to maintain a relationship with their mother, and their father gets the same treatment for staying aloof, being a spineless father. Answer. My neighbor was put in prison for intimacy assaulting his granddaughters. His son, the father of the girls, vowed he would never forgive him. To this day, I regret not telling everyone that the father of the girls molested me when I was a kid. I'm so sad about those 2 girls, but their father is as sick as his father was as well. He just never got caught. Story 41. My mother has a somewhat strange belief that after passing, a person must be buried whole. Decades ago, when my grandma had to have her leg amputated because of diabetes, my mother dug a hole behind our house and stored the amputated leg there. I believe it didn't rot due to formalin or something similar. When my grandmother died, my mother took that leg and placed it in her coffin. Due to the coffin's design, no one noticed her real leg was there. Everyone likely assumed it was a prosthetic leg. My mother told me this after several years, and I am still grossed out by it to this day. Story 42. I have a friend whose uncle won the lottery in the 90s. Something like 25,000. He never told anyone and never made any changes to his lifestyle. His uncle had made strategic investments over the years, and when he died young, in his 50s, in 2005, he had about $40,000 in accounts that his will instructed to distribute between his 2 kids and my buddy and his sister. I think my buddy and his sister both ended up with $1,000 each in trust funds, and his kids got significant chunks also in trust funds. Everyone was shocked when all of a sudden they find out this dude was worth north of $40,000 but still worked a normal job, drove a normal car, never gave any hints that he was loaded. Me and this buddy drifted apart, but I spoke with him briefly about 2 years ago and asked him how the money ended up being. He got access to it when he was, I think, 21 and dropped out of college and bought rental properties and now is functionally retired. Good for him. Story 43. In the late 1980s, my dad picked up a woman hitchhiking her way to Daytona in Florida. He must have gotten extremely lucky that day because that woman ended up being Eileen Warnos. Story 44. Not someone specifically, but in general. The amount of girls that get sad when young is horrifying. I didn't think it was that bad as they show in movies and such until I grew up and started talking to friends. It's bad. Answer. Yup. I have an aunt who's a bit off. After a particularly frustrating interaction, my mom told my sister and I that we need to be patient with her due to her past trauma. It turns out that she was routinely molested as a kid by a neighbor's husband while the neighbor was providing her after-school care. She also was almost kidnapped while walking to a store up the road, but luckily a neighbor saw it happen and intervened. Apparently, these 2 things turned her into a completely different person. Story 45. I don't know her personally, but I know of her. She was married to my uncle, Dad's brother. They were divorced before I was born. She became a foster parent and was big into exotic animals. She tried to trade one of her adopted kids for a monkey. It was all over the news. I saw it and was like, that's fudge up. Then my crazy aunt called me and asked me about the story and then told me who it was. Story 46. It blew my mind when my family told me my 2 uncles from Connecticut were gay. I thought they were just best friends. Story 47. I had a super chill coworker, mid-40s, super friendly, kind of a dad joke kind of guy. Everyone liked him. One day he casually mentioned something about back when I used to tour with Metallica. We all laughed, thinking he was joking. He wasn't. Turns out, in the late 80s and early 90s, He was a backup guitar tech and occasional fill-in for major metal bands. Not just Metallica, also Slayer and Megadeth. He even played on stage a few times when one of the band members was too hard to perform. Dude had been on international tours, partied with rock legends, and had stories that sounded straight out of a VH1 Behind the Music episode. The wildest part? He'd never brought it up before. Just left it behind to raise his kids and work a normal job. Total legend living in plain sight. Story 48. We had a few in the friend group that all hung around in the same coffee shop in high school, and a few years beyond school. One dropped off the map, heard nothing for years, then saw a newspaper article that he got arrested for essaying a cow, literally caught with his pants down. Two and darker, was a bit of a flighty guy, did a lot of substances, wanted to be a writer, and was generally a pretty nice guy. Saw on the news he'd been arrested for take down his GF. Story 49. A close friend I know via my wife. She was involved in intense adult content. We lived in Montreal, which is where a lot of the big companies are housed. She had done it to pay for school, and I knew her 10 years later. You wouldn't have assumed, and she never brought it up, but I was later told she did it for a well-known company. Story 50. Had a great uncle that was a bit of a recluse. He'd visit him a few times a year. He lived in a very small beach town. He was really lovely, covered in tattoos. He would bring out textures so we, kids, could color in his tattoos. After he passed away, I was told he had done over 20 years in jail for eliminate someone. Apparently, a man threatened his girlfriend and pushed her off his motorbike, so he bashed them to passing with a pipe. Oh, and that when in jail, he had someone tattoo a little suit and smiley face on his male body part, then had it pierced and had a chain attached so he could make his little fella dance bizarre guy, but was always so great to me. Story 51. Someone I baby sat back in the day went to prison for takedown. Jesse was the sweetest, cutest little boy, and it breaks my heart to see what happened to him. Last I heard, he was paroled. Story 52. Earl worked with a guy in the mid-80s that eliminated his best friend. They were drinking at a bar and somehow got in an argument. Elle was told they were as tight as they could be. The guy punched his best friend. The guy fell and hit his head and died. He was lucky and somehow got work release. His father picked him up at prison every morning and came to take him back when our shift was over. I always wonder what happened to him and when he was fully released. Story 53. Football star at my high school, class of 2015. Essayed a bunch of girls from my class. I only knew him from friends of friends. My best friends in HS got questioned by detectives when building a case against the guy. Once it came out, he was banned from our school district and all college football offers pulled. About a year ago or so, I saw his obituary. He died in a motorcycle accident. It doesn't surprise me, though. Story 54. I used to live with one guy, and these other two guys used to come frequently visit us. When I moved out of the place after a year or so, all three of them committed a takedown to steal $2,000 off a guy. Story 55. When I played Little League Baseball, the dad of one of my teammates was one of our coaches every year. Very nice guy, good at coaching little kids and teaching us the game. But years later, I found out he wasn't just in the KKK, but was some kind of grand wizard or dragon or whatever they call themselves. Even for Alabama in the early 1980s, that was absolutely scandalous, at least among those of us who played for him as kids. It was the first time I realized you never really know somebody. Story 56. CP in my dad's computer, and also finding out my partner of 5 years was a really loud incel online who not only disseminated dislike discourse against women and me OFC, but also shared very sensitive information and pictures of me online. Answer: incels hide it so well. My ultra-nice coworker, type of guy who holds doors open for people and always volunteers to help others, didn't drop a Tate is right about some things bomb till I knew him for 3 years. Another weird thing he said the other day was when he was talking about catching shoplifters at his old job. The women are more evil than the men when they get caught because they start crying. Like when a guy steals, he's just being an idiot, but the women are evil. They try to psychologically manipulate people with their tears. So male thieves are just harmless goofballs. Female thieves are Machiavelli. Story 57. Earth science teacher in HS. Was utterly beloved by the community for his outreach, love of life, and passion for teaching the upcoming generations. Turns out it was all a ploy. He was a massive pedophile who used his outreach program to intimacy assault the immigrant children he was claiming to help and get terabytes of adult content made off of them, which he distributed. Also turns out he had countless inappropriate shots of his high school students as well, ranging back to early in his career. He had set up cameras in his room to catch inappropriate angles. Man is rightfully serving life in prison with no parole from what I was told. Story 58. When I was about 14, 15, 16, I had two of my friends sleep over. The next morning, my mother was making us breakfast. My mom asked my friends if anyone wanted a banana. My one friend said he'd like one, so my mother gave it to him. It looked like he was jacking off the banana. All of us were like, "What are you doing?" In that moment, he was very obviously embarrassed and admitted he did not know how to open a banana. I did feel bad because, of course, we're all laughing at him in this moment, but I do wonder how my friend made it to high school without ever experiencing how a banana is open. Story 59. Was watching a police investigation show and see my neighbor on the show being interrogated. He eliminated his girlfriend over 20. This was apparently 30 years ago. I had no idea. Story 60. Stephen Akin-Muriel, serial killer. I worked with him in a dodgy half-naked bar for around a year, and we hung out sometimes. He met my mom. He turned out to be a serial killer with hatred for old people. If anyone looks up the story, I'm one of the so-called degenerates that was taking substances, ecstasy and speed, with him in 24-hour nightclubs in Manchester after work finished. Story 61. My great-uncle passed away about a year ago, and while it wasn't super unexpected, it devastated his family because he was an amazing guy and 1,000 a family man. He had 2 kids and they were the light of his life, and him the light of theirs. His son flew into town and was a mess the entire weekend. Made an amazing eulogy and just all around spent the entire weekend recounting his relationship with his dad and their love for each other. Somehow, a few days after the arrangements, their relationship came up in conversation with my mom. One thing leads to another, and my uncle spills the beans that the son is not actually my great-uncle's son. Apparently, it was pretty well known that my great-aunt had an affair with a local cop that my great-uncle never somehow knew about. There was a short separation, and when you do the math, the son was absolutely conceived during the separation. He also looks nothing like his dad and 100 like the cop. It wasn't necessarily earth-shattering because I have no skin in the game, and it was clear that no matter what my great-uncle and his son had the relationship of a father and son, whether my great-uncle knew or not, he didn't care and treated that boy as his own. But it made me appreciate just how kind, gentle, and innocent of a man my great-uncle was, and also how much of a hussy my great-aunt was, because the adultery stories continued LOL. Story 62. Apparently he was in contact with a clown, actual clown, in Florida, and they conspired to kidnap some children, and the guy I used to know was going to keep one in his basement in a cage so he could eat the kid. Story 63. There was a guy in high school who became a part of our friend group who was always seen as someone who had a screw loose, but nothing too crazy. He was outgoing and had a lot of friends, but you'd be able to tell that he lacked empathy if you spent enough time with him. Eventually, we all cut him off for it, and during the time after we did, he began going to jail like once every year for different things, until finally he went off and stabbed his father to passing in gruesome fashion, has currently in prison back home serving his sentence. Story 64. I moved in with a roommate, his mommy and daddy were right, and bought him a house, and he rented out the rooms. I'm in there a week and my coworker says, "You moved in with Mike?" Tells me not to get too invested in Mike. He famously got his own sister tipsy when she was 16 and turned his high school basketball team loose on her. They ran a train on her in what was assumed to be an attempt to gain popularity with his team, which notably didn't like him. I thought clearly a rumor, but asked around and it was either a widespread rumor or true. Everyone who knew about this guy, his family, their business, knew this story. Story 65. My sister's husband was raping their kids. He never seemed even remotely interested in his kids. There were no weird interactions. The only thing anyone ever said was that he needed to get more involved. A daughter he had with an ex accused him, and he said she was lying for her mom to get back at him. And honestly, we all believed it. Then they interviewed the younger kids he had with my sister and arrested him immediately. He admitted it. Just blew everyone away. Story 66. After my grandmother died, we found out she'd been married before my grandfather and had 4 kids. When she and the first guy decided to split, they just dumped the kids off at an orphanage and went their separate ways. She married my grandpa, had another family, and just never mentioned the fact that she had 4 other kids, and my grandpa knew the whole time and never said anything either. Story 67. Worked with 2 different people at 2 different places who both went to prison for making counterfeit U.S. money. One after I left the company, the other before I knew them. Both workplaces were printing companies. I had replaced the first guy who had gotten demoted for not being a good leader supervisor. When the Secret Service approached his mobile home, he stuffed hordes of bills in plastic trash bags and tried to make his escape by running through the woods, which tore multiple holes in the bags, leaving a scattering of counterfeit bills trailing behind him through the forest before his inevitable capture. I am the one who promoted the second guy to run the scanner on third shift. Back when high-end scanners were $250,000 in complex, only highly skilled operators could get the best result. She scanned the bills, made the plates, and ran the press, all on Saturday nights when production was closed. Story 68. My close friend for over 4 years on the surface looked like really rich. Designer bags, vacations, grand parties. They turned out to be scammers who scammed our friends and fled. They have scammed other circles in the past to get to have the money they have been spending. Rinse and repeat. Story 69. My cousin's sister-in-law take down her husband a few years ago. I've known them for over 2 years. He was such an abusive jerk, even his mother testified on her behalf. Story 70. One of my closest friends was a pedo. He was molesting his teenage stepdaughter and adopted daughter while they slept at night. He eliminated himself while on a business trip when confronted about it. Initially, his father told us that he eliminated himself due to mental health issues. His wife didn't immediately return texts or phone calls for some time after, which we now understand. So many of us were reeling in how our happy-go-lucky friend got so depressed that he eliminated himself. I went weeks feeling a gut punch about it and how I missed the signs of him being depressed. Then my wife went over, where his wife told her all about it. I went from hurt and confused to pissed and really just wanting to forget about the guy. I still don't understand any of it. The guy never, almost oddly so, never discussed intimacy in any way. Didn't really even joke about intimacy ever. He was that one friend that just really never brought it up or really engaged in guy talk. We actually thought that he was closeted gay, if anything, which he knew would be fine with all of us, of course. When I heard that he eliminated himself, I initially thought that living in the closet was too much for him, and this was why. Then to find out he was a pedo was even more confusing. I considered him to be a good person, and I was wrong. When I talked with his wife, I let her know what I was feeling, and she said, "Don't feel that way." I was his wife, and I had no idea that he was, or that he was even possible of doing something like this. It's been about 5 months and I'm still lost on it all. Another was a coworker who eliminated his wife in a fit of jealous rage. That still shocks me some 25 years later. Story 71. My husband had some wild coworkers when we lived in Illinois. He came home one day and told me one of them had been in prison for manslaughter. We're both guilty of minding our own business to a fault, so I was surprised when he had the tea. A group of guys were drinking and at some point someone had a firearm out. He accidentally shot his buddy in the thigh, and they decided he would just sleep it off. Homie did not wake up. Another coworker there went to visit his girlfriend and apparently did copious amounts of substances to the point he was running through her apartment building, naked and smashing light bulbs until the cops showed up and tased him. At least 3 people I've loosely known were eventually caught with child SA material. None of them were the weird loners people would like to expect. Story 72. My college situationship was kicked out of the NYC school system for sending groomery IG messages to a student at his school starting when she was 15. Found out, BC, a mutual friend, sent me the NY Post article exposing him. Story 73. Recently found out that the CPO at work, whom I have worked with for nearly 2 decades, is extremely racist, to the point that race alone is the deciding factor on which applicants are considered for a position. Story 74. I went to college with a Romanian student named Stefan. I knew him for the entirety of my time there, and we had a slew of mutual friends. I found out 10 years later that he was actually a guy named Steven from upstate New York. Story 75. The guy I lost my virginity to, I was 13, he was 14, is in prison for takedown. He became an addict and a few years ago burgled this old lady's house one night, but she came downstairs and caught him. He pushed past her to escape, and she fell and was injured and died the next day. Edit. Corrected from injured herself too, was injured. Story 76. I met an Ivy League type through work. We're both males, married. He's New Englandish, calm, refined. He's been to a trade show and saw a demo of a new machine, and to describe its capabilities, he casually used the most racist phrase I've ever heard. And I grew up in the 50s, in a racist, working-class town. Shut me down. I never spoke to him again. Racism, the rot in America's soul. Story 77. My brother believes some crazy things. One crazy thing he said is that he's not racist. I hope not. Biracial people tend to be a little messed up in the head. Dude for real said that he doesn't think that black and white and any other races were meant to mix up the bloodline. What's really crazy about him saying that is that we have some biracial family. We're a black family and at least 2 of our cousins, also black, are married to white women and have biracial kids. Answer. Durthworm, biracial, BW here. I don't know if your brother is black or white, but this is a problem on both sides. My family has always been very accepting of all races, but there's a lot of people who feel like keeping their race separate. A la Dr. Umar. I don't really agree that this is even a logical point, because most black Americans are not 100% African genetically. Most white Americans are a mixture of different ethnicities as well. Black and white don't even have agreed upon definitions. Story 78. Former boss was in a semi-notorious video of street racing that went wrong in Houston. His was the one with the license plate chainsaw. Story 79. My best friend and I met in the shelter system, and there was one particular staff member that worked at our housing site that absolutely had it out for us from the moment we first met. Constantly mean and condescending, always making snide little comments, and would do anything in her power to get us in trouble. She especially seemed to despise that we both needed accommodations with our house chores, as I have some upper body mobility issues, and my bestie has a genetic condition, EDS, that makes regular chores too painful for him. She would always try to force us to do the chores normally and whinge about how she thinks we were just lying to take advantage of the staff. She was such a menace that we'd have to leave the site entirely if she was working because it just wasn't worth the stress. One time after she practically forced us out in the night with her abusive behavior, my best friend went on an angry crash-out rant about how he hoped she'd just fudge die or something so we don't have to see her again. We were fully not expecting it to actually happen, much less like 2 weeks after that day. We were informed by the shelter staff that she had died, and everyone treated it like she passed away from an unexpected illness or some kind of accident. So one of our friends did some searching to see what happened to her out of curiosity. Turns out she was a severely mentally, physically, emotionally, and financially abusive piece of shit to her longtime mentally and physically disabled girlfriend. And after years of the girlfriend trying to leave her but being coerced back into the relationship repeatedly, the girlfriend shot her point blank in the street in front of a deli we'd walked past dozens of times. I remember in the article I read about it that the girlfriend's family had tried repeatedly to help her out of the relationship over the years, but said that it felt hopeless because she just weaseled her way back into her life with promises of better treatment, and she'd get sucked back in again, and they'd tried just about anything to get her away safely and permanently. We always knew something was up about her and her feelings towards disabled people, but we certainly wouldn't have expected that she was going home to literally torture someone just like us after she clocked out. Story 80. There was a priest at my church growing up that always made me uncomfortable, but never could pinpoint why. I became an adult and grew away from the church altogether. I'd attend for holidays with the family, but that's it. 9 years ago, my dad got sick, and this priest gave him his last rites. He spent a good amount of time in our home during our darkest and most vulnerable time as a family as spiritual support. Shortly after my dad passed, he moved to another church, and then stories started rolling out about him. He'd been caught inappropriately texting, although not intimacy, underage boys at the school attached to the new church. And then more victims came forth who were assaulted as far back as the late 80s. I know a few were friends I'd had when I was in the youth group growing up. Fudge broke me. He was always close with a lot of the families, including ours. We was with us at the darkest time, acting as a holy man, while fully knowing what he'd done. Disgust doesn't scratch the surface of the emotions I feel. And how many families had he done it for? How many victims didn't speak? Any remaining ties to religion died in me that day. I can't morally or ethically support that in any form. The final sting was that he only got 5 years. 5 fudge years for ruining countless lives. He was thankfully defrocked, and I hope the rest of his life is one he deserves. Thank you for watching the video all the way to the end. If you'd like to see more content like this, you might be interested to know that I've created another channel with a similar theme, especially for those of you who enjoy what I do. I'll leave a link in the description, and I hope to see you there. Take care.